Galveston, Texas. This well-known resort town for many years is and has been a beautiful location, with its very open and welcoming community accompanied by clear skies, birds flying overhead, and in all hours of both day and night, a marvelous view of the Gulf of Mexico. But on the shore of the island, there is a structure that tells a story of terror, tragedy, and destruction. It stands at 17 feet tall, with a 16-foot base width and at the top 5 feet wide. Constructed in 1902, this seawall is a reminder of a very painful history. 120 years ago, Galveston was the fourth largest city in the entire state of Texas and was by far the wealthiest. Many people called it the Wall Street of the Southeast due to its immense popularity. The town's wealth showed through many of the homes on the island. Many visitors made the observation that a lot of the homes on the island looked like miniature castles. A lot of the town's financial success came from their prosperous deep sea port. According to a statement made on the episode of When Weather Changed History, it was, quoted, perfectly situated to handle the country's thrive in cotton and agricultural trade, end quote. While the Gulf side of the island is where all of the children swim and play, the north side of the island is where all of the port business is run. The Galveston port was often in competition with the Houston port off the coast of the mainland. In the late 1800s, there was a dreadful hurricane that caused great damage to both the city and to the business of the port. This is largely due to the fact that many people after the hurricane swept through believed that the Galveston port was not safe to be running business, as products could be heavily damaged or destroyed by poor weather conditions, creating monstrous waves. There is one man that the residents look to for a solution. Isaac Klein is the town's chief weather expert. Of everyone on the island, he is by far the most credible. When consulted, he believed that the town was actually very safe. This put the town at ease. Little did they know what hell awaited them. Sometime near the end of August in the year 1900, between the Caribbean and Africa, a storm was beginning to form. By the 31st of August, the storm had traveled due west and is just south of Puerto Rico by a mere 200 miles. It moved across the Dominican Republic and Haiti, all before then changing course. On Tuesday, September 4th, the United States Weather Bureau sent an advisory telegraph to Isaac Klein's office in Galveston regarding a tropical storm disturbance that was currently moving northward over Cuba. Isaac acknowledges this warning and takes note of it, but is still not concerned for the safety of the people. 2 days later, on Thursday, September 6th, warnings of a large hurricane had been received in Louisiana and all along the East Coast. Even Boston received an advisory. Still, Galveston was not at all worried, for they still were enjoying the sun, despite another warning coming from Pensacola, Florida. The next day, ignorant bliss would still be flowing throughout the city. Isaac Klein lived in a home just a couple blocks from the beach with his wife, 3 young daughters, and his brother Joseph, whom he worked with. And on Saturday, September 8th, 1900, Joseph awoke at 4 o'clock in the morning to see that their backyard was several inches deep in water. He ran to wake Isaac, and they both ran to the shore to see giant waves crashing on the beach. But as they watched, they noticed that it wasn't going to get any worse. So they returned to their home and went back to sleep. Little did they know, they were in for a rude awakening. At approximately 8 a.m. that same morning, just 4 hours after the brothers witnessed the large waves, rain began pouring and did not stop. At first, the people seemed to actually enjoy the rainy weather. The island had suffered from a heat wave for the past week. As water flowed, creating a small stream running down the sidewalks, the children were actually seen playing in the water. Everything seemed fine for a time, but by 10 o'clock, the sidewalks that were flowing streams were now flowing with madness, with winds and waves pounding out at 120 to 135 miles per hour. Storm surge was nearly 15 feet high, making it a Category 4 hurricane. Houses and buildings were torn apart, brick by brick, everything being slammed by monstrous waves that flushed out everything in its wake. The streets run by water were filled with everything you could imagine: wood, furniture, pianos, debris, and people. But most of all, sheer madness. The Kleins were confined in their home along with a few neighbors. Isaac stood in horror of what he was seeing. He saw the water level outside his window raise 4 feet in just 4 seconds. He was lost for words. Then, suddenly, a railroad trestle knocked the Kleins' home off of its foundation, and then it began to sink. The family managed to escape, but Isaac's wife, along with all of their neighbors that they had inside their home, had perished. Finally, after long hours of sheer terror, the water flow slowly comes to a halt, and it discontinued its consumption of the entire city. This is due to the overwhelming amount of debris. Once the water got to a certain point, the amount of debris overcame the water and acted as a blockade to the rest of the city. Assessing the state of the city did not commence until the next morning. The damage was incomprehensible, but not as tragic as the amount of bodies that there were. 6,000 to 8,000 Galveston residents perished, and as many as 12,000 people on the entire island had perished from the most deadly hurricane in American history. With the city population being 36,000 people, almost a quarter of the entire city residents was dead. Far too. They resorted to sending bodies out on barges to be taken off of the island. And when bodies began washing up ashore, they had no choice other than to burn them to keep toxins from being spread. Aside from the lives lost, the townspeople were met with a choice. They could either abandon the city or they could attempt to rebuild. Some choose to go, but many choose to stay and rebuild. 3,600 buildings were destroyed in the hurricane. It took almost 2 years for them to clear the island of any debris from the disaster. In 1902, they began construction on trying to make their island a safer environment. Working together, they managed to raise 2,146 buildings in an effort to raise the sea level of the entire island. After months of letting the earth dry, they placed the buildings on the new foundations. It was a success. They also began construction on the 17-foot seawall. They were sure to build it higher than the storm surge of the hurricane. All of these projects were done by the year 1910. But with the warning that came from Florida, as well as the warnings issued from the U.S. Weather Bureau, you think they would have prepared themselves for this natural disaster. How is it that the island had received so many warnings, but managed to dismiss them so quickly? Well, there are plenty of reasons. And no, it is not at the fault of Isaac Klein, nor his brother. The first on the list of reasons is that when Isaac Klein was consulted about the danger of the storms hitting and destroying the island, he proposed that it was not scientifically possible for a cyclone to create a storm wave that would reach the town. At that time in history, it was believed that shallow waves were not capable of making large tidal surges. In other words, the continental shelf in the Gulf near the island is extremely shallow. Isaac believed that the water would spread out across the shelf and thin out before even reaching the city. That is one reason why the town stayed in their state of bliss leading up to the storm. Another reason is that the night the Klein brothers were standing out on the shore as waves were crashing, Isaac went back to check barometric pressure. Barometric pressure is the pressure put upon a certain point on Earth put on by air molecules. When he saw that the barometric pressure had hardly changed, he assumed that it would maintain its current state and then go back to normal. Though, because he was incorrect that it would be safe, the barometric pressure during the storm dropped down to 28.43 inches, the lowest that the U.S. Weather Bureau had ever recorded on dry land. On top of this evidence that things would die down, Galveston was not receiving the proper updates that it should have been receiving from the Weather Bureau. This is why many place the blame of the incident on the U.S. government. In the past, the Washington Weather Bureau operated by receiving information on weather from local offices, including offices in Cuba, who, in quote, had pioneered the science of hurricane prediction, end quote. However, after the Spanish-American War of the year 1898, the U.S. government set up their own observers in Cuba. It is believed that the U.S. government were actually jealous of Cuba's weather prediction accuracy. Therefore, they censored the weather forecasts coming in from Cuba. This is because they believed that they were more scientifically advanced than the Cubans. Cuba had predicted the hurricane and saw that it was only going to get stronger as it traveled across the Mexican Gulf. Because of the censoring, the city never receives this news. Galveston was still under the impression that the hurricane would move north to Florida and then travel up the East Coast. This, perhaps, was the largest reason the city, the whole island, was not prepared. Though Isaac Klein and his brother Joseph were put in charge of looking out for the city and protecting them from this type of situation, neither of them were blamed for the incident. Many state that the both of them were simply men of their age and did the best with what they knew and had. After the Great Storm of 1900, the U.S. government uncensored the Cuban Weather Bureau forecasts, so never again would their arrogance become their demise.